Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our news conference on the conclusion of the meeting of Think20, also known as the T20 here in Ottawa. My name is Tammy Bender. I'm the Communications Manager for the Centre for International Governance Innovation, which is based in Waterloo, Canada, and is also the co-host of this conference along with the Economic Policy Research Foundation of Turkey, also known as TPAF. There are media kits available at the back of the room for journalists who are on site here. We are also going to be running this news conference live via webcast and globally, and we've had additional media who have registered to be on that. So we invite our online participants to submit their questions to our speakers via Twitter using the hashtag CGLive. As well, Alicia Clancy, who's here with us today from the Global Economy team at CG, is going to be providing those questions to us so that they can be answered. If you are here in the room, please feel free to ask any questions of our participants, and we will filter those through. And our purpose today is to report on the outcome of the meeting of the T20 here in Ottawa over the last 2 days. We ask that questions are kept focused on the T20 today where possible. And as well, I am pleased to introduce today, seated at the farthest to my left here, the Right Honourable Paul Martin, the former Prime Minister of Canada. Beside Mr. Martin is Ünsal Subah, the Director of G20 Studies Center at TPAV in Turkey. And also directly beside me here is Rohinton Medhora, our President at CG, which is based in Waterloo, Ontario. I will turn it over now to each of our speakers to speak for a few moments, specifically on the conference and on T20, and then we will proceed to questions. Rohinton.
Great. Thank you. So when the G20 was created, first at the finance ministers level in 1997-98, and then escalated to the leaders level at the start of the current crisis in 2007-8, it was dealing with a set of complex global issues, but it didn't really have a technical institution that could permanently support its dialogue. And so it was in that context that CG catalyzed a network informally of think tanks around the world, located mainly but not entirely in the G20 countries, to actually deliberate on the G20 agenda on what was on it, what should be on it, but also what was likely to be on it as we moved ahead. That process got an important fillip during the Mexican presidency of the G20 in 2012, when the Mexican presidency, in fact, the G20 then gave this network of think tanks official sanction. And so that we now have a process which we call the T20, which meets regularly and is convened by the lead think tank in the host country of the G20. And CG has been fortunate to be part of this process from the beginning. And so my colleagues at TPAV and CG convened the meeting that just ended, in which I thought we had a rich set of discussions that actually go beyond discussions, because we had practitioners and people from the G20 machinery in the room as well. And we will get into that as the dialogue this afternoon continues. But I was struck by the importance of having outside analysis and critique of the kinds of issues that our leaders discuss. And also, when we get to climate change, we can talk about that. The importance of not setting limits on what countries can and cannot do, because there are some issues that won't go away. There are some issues that are truly global, and that's why, in fact, the G20 was created. Thank you.
Thank you. Turn it over now to Ünsal Subah from TPAF.
Thank you. As Mr. President mentioned, T20 serves as an ideas bank for the G20 leaders and all the G20 machinery, which has tens of working groups and tens of ministerial meetings and this big leaders summit every year. So it provides some continuity and it also provides some new ideas. And our the Deputy Prime Minister Babacan, in the opening event that we co-hosted again with CG this February in Istanbul, said we are looking for some crazy ideas from T20 Turkey this year. Now we are trying to produce those crazy ideas, and I think this workshop was one of the big achievements to that end. TPAV chairs the Think20 Turkey this year. It is one of the largest think tanks in Turkey. We have been partnering with CG, and it has been a pleasure from the beginning, since 2012. And Mr. Prime Minister Paul Martin's visit to Turkey last year also brought some impetus to the process and also brought some lessons to our policymakers with regards to G20 that Turkey chairs this year. And we are looking forward to having more events this year and a very close dialogue. This year, we are also enhancing the span of issues that Think20 covers. So on top of the traditional core issues like financial stability, global governance, infrastructure, investment, trade that are included in G20, we are also covering some future issues like innovation, like internet governance, and we are having seminars on these issues. We will convene the results of these regional and thematic seminars to G20 Sherpas and deputies in June, and then to finance ministers in September, and eventually to the leaders in Antalya in November. So we are looking forward to this busy year and having a fruitful conversation.
Those of you who follow the G7 know that the G7 is essentially 7 compatible economies. When you look at the G20, which represents over 80% of the global economy, what you'll see, for instance, is a number of years ago, the Korean summit, which was the first G20 summit ever held in an Asian country. Not that long ago, there was the summit in Mexico, which was the first G27, in fact, the first G summit ever held in a Latin American country. And the summit that is about to occur in Turkey will be the first time that a G20 summit has been held in a country with a population that was a majority Muslim. What this really shows is that the G20 is really a meeting of many different religions, many different political systems, many different cultures, but they represent the world. And the importance of the T20, which both TPAV and CG stand for, is to do all of that policy work that brings all of these different thinkers together. When you see the G20 meeting, when you see the one in Turkey, what you'll see is the leaders at a summit. But an enormous amount of work will have been done by TPAV and by CG and by the group of thinkers that we just met with. And fundamentally, if the world is going to come together, if we're going to make globalization work, that's the way it has to happen. Si vous me permettez simplement de vous dire que le but vraiment de notre rencontre a été vraiment de faire marcher la globalisation pour que ça y ait un bénéfice là-dedans pour tout le monde. Je dois vous dire que les discussions ont été très fructueuses. I want to congratulate TPAV and I want to congratulate CG. These meetings that we have just held here in Ottawa, I believe were as good as any I've attended, and that's really because of the both of you and your organizations.
Thank you. We'll move it on now to questions. If we have any in the room. None specifically in the room. Do we have any from online? Alicia.
I have one from online for the panel. What role does the T20 feel that the G20 could play in supporting other global institutions? Is this something where they could expand their mandate?
Well, that sounds like that comes from my first cousin. I spoke about this yesterday, and I think it is important. The G20 was created fundamentally to make globalization work for everyone. The great multilateral institutions that you've referred to were created to make globalization work for everyone, whether it be the IMF, whether it be the United Nations, the World Bank, whatever. The problem is that the great multilateral institutions are having their difficulties. Just as one example, there's a very important agreement that was settled in Seoul on the reform, the governance reform and the quotas for the IMF, to essentially recognize that the world has changed fundamentally since the IMF was created. That reform has been agreed to by everybody, but is being held up by the US Congress. And that is an indication of some of the problems the other institutions are having. Just to simply give you two very quick examples. The Ebola crisis was a terrible tragedy. Doctors Without Borders actually performed wonderful work, and the WHO, the World Health Organization, it took them a lot longer to get up to snuff. That's not the fault of the WHO, which is a UN agency. It is the fault of the UN members who are not properly funding it. And part of our role is to make sure that these institutions are taken care of. We've all seen the terrible maritime tragedies in the Mediterranean. As refugee upon refugee tries to leave from Africa and from the Middle East, tries to get to Europe. We're seeing the fact that Turkey has over 2 million Syrian refugees on its border. And there is a UN Commission for Refugees. It too hasn't got the funding to deal with the issues that it's trying to deal with. And again, it's an organization like the T20, which is essentially taking the lead on saying, look, globalization will not work if the multilateral institutions which are there to make globalization work are not properly supported by the G20 members. And I think we made that case very strongly.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? for
I
online?
have one additional question. What are the next steps for the T20? How does it plan to proceed leading up to the G20? And what are the other items that they believe should be included?
Let me briefly explain for this year, and then maybe we can discuss for the next years. This year, the next steps are first to finalize the thematic and regional seminars that I mentioned. There will be one in Berlin in 2 weeks on innovation, and then in Cairo on internet governance. These are all new issues to G20. In the meantime, of course, we are continuing working level dialogue with the G20. So we are invited to a number of working groups that the officials from G20 countries get together. For example, right after this, on Thursday, we'll present to the employment working group in Istanbul, which is a newly established one, on new ideas on employment, wage-led growth, and reskilling, those kind of things. And we are keeping this dialogue at working group level with, on all the issues to the extent that is possible. After that, as I said, there will be a series of workshops that we will meet with the senior policymakers, with the Sherpas and deputies, with the finance ministers, and finally with the leaders. And then the Chinese will take over, and we'll see what they plan, their creative ideas to enhance the T20 network.
Thank you.
Can I comment on that?
Absolutely. Wellington.
So you also asked about what other issues might enter the G20 ambit that the T20 discussed. And I'd make 2 points about that. One is that thanks to the Turkish presidency, they have added to the words implementation and investment, which were carried over from past summits, the word inclusiveness. And so one thing we have to think about, as Mr. Martin mentioned, the G20 represents 80% of the world economy. It was a group that came together in crisis, but there's still the sense that the G20 is the custodian of the world's global public goods, and how can it better do that? And so we had a long discussion on how we might bring in perhaps voices that are missing. Some of that is being taken care of by these parallel 20 tracks that we have. The business 20 is an important constituency, but Africa is underrepresented in the G20. There are reasons why Nigeria could not or did not join early on. And so we have to think about how we can bring in developing country voices in general and African voices in particular. So that's one. The other point I'd make is actually on climate change, which is one of those subjects that the G20 has frankly paid lip service to, and sometimes not even that. And yet, climate change is absolutely the kind of issue for which surely the G20 at the leaders level was created. It knows no boundaries, it is truly global. Piecemeal solutions do not add up to a global solution, although things like the US-China Accord and Ontario, Quebec, and California joining forces make a difference, but that can't be the sum total of it. The reason this is now, in our view, a strong G20 subject is because this is indeed an economic and financial stability issue. This is not a social or political or environment issue only, although those are all important things. Bank of England Governor Mark Carney has made now the point that if we are to achieve our 2-degree limit, then there's going to be a host of stranded assets, which is to say that oil and gas companies will not be able to use and capitalize on about 40 to 60% of their assets in the ground. This affects the valuation of that sector, and that in turn has a direct financial implication for the world. Extreme weather is playing havoc with the balance sheets of insurance companies, another financial implication of climate change. And we also know from an IMF study, no less, that subsidies to fossil fuel, not only are they a drain on the treasury, they're bad for the environment, and they're anti-poor, because the people who access these subsidies tend to be rich and middle-class people. So a strong case can be made for why the G20 has to become much more serious about climate change. I thought we had very robust discussions about that in the last day and a half. And I expect this is the kind of thing when Mr. Martin says that a whole bunch of homework has to be done before leaders can get to something. I thought that and sovereign debt resolution being the other were the two top topics on which we spent a lot of time, and I know we will later this year in Turkey as well, to prepare the broader discussion at the political level.
If I might, if I might, I really want to congratulate my two colleagues. You know, the T20 is important because it's important for the reasons that they both gave in terms of the G20. But timing is very important, and to have the skill to understand that. So think about this. First of all, you had the U.S.-China agreement on climate change. And now what's going to happen in November is going to be the Turkish summit. And we discussed climate change, and they put it on the table very, very clearly. But that summit is going to be followed a month later by the climate change meeting in Paris in December. And then less than a year after that will be the G20 summit in China. And I think that this was a very important meeting for that reason. Because what you really want to do is give the UN momentum. I'm sorry.
No. I want to briefly talk about one more thing. When it comes to implementation, I think one of the important things is these legacy institutions that G20 presidencies are creating. And Turkey is also working on one of them. As T20, we are also involved in this together with the Business 20. It is the World SME Forum, which will be a totally privately run institution, so there is no public involvement. The Turkish Union of Chambers and the International Chamber of Commerce are the founding members, and the purpose is to advocate for SMEs, which is one of the themes of this year, in the public policy circles. For example, in the Financial Stability Board, when the new regulations are designed, there are unintended consequences on SME lending. And no one is there to argue on behalf of the SMEs. So this institution will be a policy advocacy body powered by T20 and B20 to argue for these kind of policy issues that will impact SMEs globally. And we are hoping for that to be a legacy institution of the Turkish presidency. Another center that we want to establish by November is a global policy dialogue platform, which will serve as a hub for T20 in the upcoming years to bring the network together and to make the policy dialogue with the G20 leaders more effective.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Embassy.
Thank you. What I would like to note here, in the press release, it was mentioned that the T20 group urges the leaders to address different issues, including the global issues such as humanitarian crisis. Turkey has humanitarian crisis. Turkey has more than 2 million Syrian refugees in the meantime. Mr. Martin pointed out the role of non-UN organizations with the crisis of Ebola. What kind of policies, strategies you would sort of recommend to the G20 leaders regarding such issues?
Well, in the case of Ebola, as an example, what happened right at the very beginning, and that's where Doctors Without Borders were able to act so quickly, was the whole question of containment. Containment meant an enormous amount in terms of preventing the spread of the disease, and unfortunately, the WHO was just not in a position to deal with it. And thank heaven, Doctors Without Borders were there. But Doctors Without Borders is an NGO; it's not a UN association ready to deal with this. Now, what has happened, and the reason for this, quite simply, is that the WHO has not been properly funded. They went through the same thing with SARS a decade ago, and they have not been properly funded despite that, despite everybody, the UN saying that they had learned their lesson. Now what is happening, I think, as a result of Ebola and as a result of pressure people are putting on, is there is now a proposal to deal with the advanced funding of vaccines. And if that happens, then what we're going to see is a much lesser danger of these kinds of contagious diseases, tropical diseases, as it spreading. But it comes down to this. This is one world. We may be different countries. We may be different continents, but we are one world. And we've got to be prepared to treat disease happening in Africa the same thing as was happening in our backyards. And that's true for all of us. And that's really the message that we would take forth.
And issues just sort of for in the region, Turkey and the Syrian refugees now.
Well,
sort of,
I think I would let my colleagues speak to this, but you think about it. I mean, Turkey has over 2 million Syrian refugees. Lebanon has over 1 million. Jordan has over 600,000. And the questions that we raise is, why is it that the countries on the borders of these things are asked to bear all of the cost of shelter? But even more to the point, the fact is that what happens is that refugees end up in refugee camps. And in so many cases, because of a lack of funding, to which the world should be contributing, the world should be contributing this funding, what you end up with is young people living in poor shelter, no medical care, no decent education. And then the question I think that we all have to answer is, what's going to happen to these kids growing up under those circumstances, bearing a grudge against an unfair world when they become adults? And the fact is that it is our children and our grandchildren that are going to pay the cost for this. And it is not fair to ask a country like Turkey any more than ask Lebanon to bear the full cost of this. And when you see the tragedies that are happening in the Mediterranean, we understand just what the fundamental shifts that cause people to have to leave their home. And this is a human problem. And as human beings, we ought to be prepared to deal with it for the good of all humanity.
If there are no other questions in the room, I understand we don't have any other ones online right now. So that will conclude our press conference today. On behalf of all of our speakers from TPAB, from CG, and the Right Honorable Paul Martin, I would like to thank everybody for joining us today, and have a very good day. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our news conference on the conclusion of the meeting of Think 20, also known as the T20 here in Ottawa. My name is Tammy Bender. I'm the Communications Manager for the Centre for International Governance Innovation, which is based in Waterloo, Canada, and is also the co-host of this conference along with the Economic Policy Research Foundation of Turkey, also known as TPAF. There are media kits available at the back of the room for journalists.
2012, when the Mexican presidency, in fact, the G20 then gave this network of think tanks official sanction. And so that we now have a process which we call the T20, which meets regularly and is convened by the lead think tank in the host country of the G20. And CG has been fortunate to be part of this process from the beginning. And so my colleagues at TPAV and CG convened the meeting that just ended, in which I thought we had a rich set of discussions that actually go beyond discussions, because we had practitioners and people from the G20 machinery in the room as well. And we will get into that as the dialogue this afternoon continues.
Focus on the T20 today where possible. And as well, I am pleased to introduce today, seated at the farthest to my left here, the Right Honourable Paul Martin, the former Prime Minister of Canada. Beside Mr. Martin is Ünsal Subah, the Director of G20 Studies Center at TPAV in Turkey. And also directly beside me here is Rohinton Medhora, our President at CG, which is based in Waterloo, Ontario. I will turn it over now to each of our speakers to speak for a few moments, specifically on the conference and on T20, and then we will proceed to questions. Rohinton.
Great. Thank you. So when the G20 was created, first at the finance ministers level in 1997-98, and then escalated to the leaders level at the start of the current crisis in 2007-8, it was dealing with a set of complex global issues, but it didn't really have a technical institution that could permanently support its dialogue. And so it was in that context that CG catalyzed a network informally of think tanks around the world, located mainly but not entirely in the G20 countries, to actually deliberate on the G20 agenda on what was on it, what should be on it, but also what was likely to be on it as we moved ahead. That process got an important fillip during the Mexican presidency of the G20 in
Us who are on site here. We are also going to be running this news conference live via webcast and globally, and we've had additional media who have registered to be on that. So we invite our online participants to submit their questions to our speakers via Twitter using the hashtag CGLive. As well, Alicia Clancy, who's here with us today from the Global Economy team at CG, is going to be providing those questions to us so that they can be answered. If you are here in the room, please feel free to ask any questions of our participants, and we will filter those through. And our purpose today is to report on the outcome of the meeting of the T20 here in Ottawa over the last 2 days. We ask that questions are kept focused